In this video, I'm going to take you through what is limerence, how it affects each of the different attachment styles in different ways at a high level, and then this will be part of a series. So you can dig in, you can check out limerence for other attachment styles and some of the key things that drive limerence for an anxious preoccupied versus fearful avoidant versus dismissive avoidant attachment style. And I'll answer the question at the end of this video, do securely attached people get limerence? So, first and foremost, limerence is essentially the state of being extremely infatuated, almost to the point of being obsessed with another person. And it tends to be something that's definitely experienced involuntarily, AKA, it exists at the subconscious level of mind. It's not something you're consciously choosing. And there can be a really strong desire for reciprocity, but a lot of times people in limerence actually don't even have reciprocity from the other person. So they can be really in this strong fantasy bond area where they're building this very rich fantasy bond, life, world with another person. Now, this exists along a continuum. I have seen people who have low level limerence who, just really are ruminating to the point of being distracted throughout the course of their own day. Like, let's say somebody's ruminating throughout the day and they're having a hard time focusing on their tasks. Then, if you keep going down the continuum, I've seen it be to the point where somebody's losing sleep. They're anxious when they go to sleep, they're anxious when they wake up. They're so fixated on this person that they are literally having a difficult time regulating themselves. Sometimes people can lose their appetite completely. It's like they have this endless feeling of butterflies in their stomach, waiting to hear from the person, thinking about the future with the person. And then I've actually seen it extend all the way out to behaviors that we could definitely constitute as on the borderline of stalking somebody. So things like, somebody rejecting them after a date, but still showing up at their place unannounced, driving by their workplace a lot of the time. And I've definitely worked with people who've come to me and said, hey, I'm having this thing where, can you help me win this person back? And then we get into it and it's like, wait, we can't do that work. Let's do the limerence work because the person's expressed that they're not interested and there's still this sort of fixation and drive to make something work out. And I want to be really clear here. Limerence tells us powerful things about the relationship to ourselves because when you understand in a moment what actually causes limerence at a subconscious level, it will help you realize that, oh, okay, this is where this is coming from. And this is telling me powerful information about what needs healing, love, or just consideration in the relationship to myself. So limerence exists along this continuum. We can have infatuation and attraction over here, but then limerence is the point where it becomes destabilizing in your life, right? There's this ruminating factor or force. It's causing you to feel disrupted in your eating, sleep, working patterns, ability to focus, how you spend your time. I've had people who are in limerence who come to me and say things like, Thais, this person, they have a Mediterranean background. So I've learned to cook all these Mediterranean dishes, but this person they've only spoken to like once in the workplace and they haven't really ever had a conversation beyond that. So people can actually change themselves and their behavior to sort of feed into this fantasy bond, so to speak. And what's really important is if you're experiencing limerence, especially strong limerence, do not judge yourself. There's nothing to be judged. There's only things to be curious about and inquire about. So what you'll see here in terms of some signs to recognize if you have limerence are you may find yourself going through obsessive thinking throughout the day, extreme longing, almost to the point of pain, almost to the point of like loneliness, yearning for somebody, or just such intense desire to get close to them, extreme fear of rejection of them at the same time. So I've seen a lot of people with limerence over the years who they may be so limerent with somebody in the workplace, maybe in this big office building, and they see the person once a week in passing. But then when they do see the person, it's like they can't even speak to the person because they're so nervous. They kind of go into freeze mode. And they can be so afraid of sort of ruining the fantasy bond because they have fed into it so much that they get afraid of having a bad interaction. So they kind of freeze and don't have any interaction because the fantasy world that they have with this person is very rich. And so the idea of, being able to have a conversation, like God forbid something goes wrong, then it can ruin this. They don't want that world that they've built to come crashing down. Another big sign is you may see that there can be fantasizing about reciprocation without actually feeding into reciprocation. But just in the very least, just having this really strong fantasy world, putting them on a major pedestal. Okay, this is another thing. Whoever you put on a huge pedestal, they are subject to the infatuation resentment cycle. In other words, the higher of a pedestal you put a person on, the further the fall from grace. And every person really, at the end of the day, is equal, right? Despite whatever stories we're programmed with, we're conditioned to think of this thing is better than this thing, or this thing is good, or this person's more successful. And so it's all just conditioning, right? They're all these just conditioned ideas. Every human being has good and bad, right and wrong. We'll even put that in quotes because it's usually just traumatized or less traumatized about them. But the stories we tell and these concepts and ideas that we feed into cause us to put people on a pedestal or cause us to put ourselves on a pedestal next to another person, depending on your conditioning and the person that you're comparing yourself to. At the end of the day, it's really all just stuff. It's all a whole bunch of conditioned ideas. They don't necessarily have any, you know, semblance in true reality, right? Objective reality without all the programmed conditions that we've received from society. But that's kind of a topic for another time. But what I do need you to see here is if you put somebody on a huge pedestal, it comes with expectations inevitably, right? If you think, oh my gosh, this person's perfect, you can see this a lot with your parents growing up, right? As a little child, your parents are your caretakers. They're kind of like a god to you. And then we have to go through in the individuation process, reconciling that our parents are just human beings too. And they'll have flaws and they'll have pain points. But the more you put your parents on a pedestal, often individuation can become more painful as you start to develop a stronger sense of self. And so the further the fall from grace, right? The moment you see that your parents do have imperfections, they are just humans. So you'll see this in romantic relationships, parental parent-child relationships, other family relationships. If you have somebody you put on a pedestal and you think they're like a superhero, they're your idol, they are the person you've looked up to your whole life, they're a human and they're going to have flaws. And so again, like the more expectations you stamp on a person, the further the fall from grace. So in romantic relationships, this can create a big dynamic for a roller coaster. And then number 6, you may see obsessive behaviors in regards to limerence. So limerence for a lot of people can feel like this fun thing, this exciting thing. But there's a lot of downsides. There's a lot of self-abandonment when we're limerent. There can be a huge roller coaster we're subject to that we get on, and the peaks mean the troughs, right? Like you can't really escape two sides of that same coin there. Often limerence-based relationships just don't work out long-term. And limerence and trauma bonding are separate things, by the way. So there can be a role of limerence in a trauma bond, but not all limerence is a trauma bond, just to be super clear. Okay. And so when we look at what causes limerence, this is like what I think is just so interesting to sink your teeth into here. Limerence is caused by 3 major things. Now, 3 major things drive attraction at the subconscious level. Our subconscious comfort zone, number 1. Number 2, when somebody meets our deeply unmet needs, this really plays a role in limerence. Okay, number 1 is just there, right? We're attracted to things that are familiar to us. Number 2, though, if you're starving for a need and somebody meets it, you have the breeding grounds for limerence to exist or take place at that level. And number 3, the other huge thing that has a huge role in limerence is golden shadow work, right? So if somebody is expressing your disowned traits, things that you're repressing or you don't believe yourself to be. So it could be, for example, that you are not an assertive person at all. And so you push down the assertiveness. You think that speaking up for yourself is bad because you were conditioned as a child to be seen and not heard. And then somebody comes along and they are assertive and you're like, wow, you really find that to be so attractive. It really draws you in. And part of it's because your subconscious mind, when it comes to traits, it's trying to create trait equilibrium. It's trying to create basically wholeness. And so when you've pushed something down and somebody comes along and expresses it, it's like they're the missing piece to your puzzle. And so you feel really drawn and attracted to that. And from a trait variety point of view, you have a better chance at surviving if you are with somebody who's expressing different traits than you. So there's that sort of biological feature there. Now, the needs can be things like somebody makes you feel seen and heard, right? And you haven't felt like that for so long. And, children often starve for that at a young age. And so if that need feels deeply unmet, especially according to what your attachment style might be, then you may be really, really drawn in. So I'm going to take you through now the different attachment styles and how they tend to experience limerence a little bit differently. And then you can stay tuned for future videos where we'll go way into the more specific traits or needs that each attachment style is probably going to be really drawn to. So stay tuned for those because you'll probably find some interesting things about yourself in that. And also, if you want to skip waiting and you want to dive right into a course that also talks about how to do the work on limerence so you get out of limerence, and also realizing that like when we are limerent, these tend to be big blockers for becoming securely attached because it tends to represent deeply unmet needs or deeply repressed traits that we have within ourselves. It's actually stopping us from reaching that secure state. So if you want to go and do a deep dive into that, I have a course you can check out for free for 7 days, all about limerence. Everything to do with limerence helps you really integrate the traits very quickly, do some deep golden shadow work on it. Um, and then also really deeply meet your needs, and find healthy strategies to meet them in the relationship to self. And usually they're going to be the needs that you're most aching to have fulfilled from somebody else because you're in most learned helplessness in the relationship to you first. So again, you can check out the link down below for free for 7 days if you want to dig right into limerence. So anxious preoccupieds, they tend to experience limerence the most. They're most likely to experience limerence because they usually have the most unmet needs in relationship to self. And they can build really strong bonds in the fantasy world. Fearful avoidants tend to experience limerence as well, but they tend to experience limerence for like shorter periods of time, and they can really swing between that infatuation and resentment cycle. And I'm not saying it's as far as like something like splitting when you talk about the idea of BPD. Um, Fearful avoidance and borderlines are different, right? And to quite strong degrees. But that's also a topic for another time. But you'll see fearful avoidance, they can go through a little bit more of that pendulum swinging. So they can experience limerence, but then they can also shut down feelings very strongly if they feel rejected. Um, and so you'll see a lot of that sort of dynamic at work. Dismissive avoidance is a really interesting thing about dismissive avoidance, when it comes to limerence, is that they will experience limerence more frequently with less available people. Because if you think about it, right? So like limerence for dismissive avoidance can often be in the context of like a movie star, a television character, um, these sorts of dynamics, people in books, and they can really get into this rich fantasy world there because it's like that person's completely unavailable to them. They don't even know them. It's not like, oh, you could build a bond with them or a relationship with them because they work down the hall in your office. It's like these unavailable people they develop limerence for, like truly unavailable. Like they don't know them, can't get into contact with them, live on the other side of the world, perhaps. And so you'll see this happen a lot. And what it does is it represents the needs being met and the traits being integrated while also bypassing the subconscious set of core wounds, fears of being vulnerable or criticized and made to feel defective or unsafe because they have to open up so much, like it really bypasses those different things and yet represents these things over here. So you can see that happen a lot more with dismissive avoidance. It can, of course, happen with all attachment styles, but I've particularly seen dismissive avoidance fall into this space the most. And then the last thing we're going to cover in this video is, do securely attached individuals experience limerence? The answer is they're very unlikely to. They will experience feelings, attraction, excitement. They can still get butterflies, but not in a destabilizing way, not where they just ruminate about somebody all day, can't think about the relationship to themselves, can't stay focused, can't eat, can't sleep. Like they won't see that kind of dynamic. And to be clear, when you become securely attached, we have this wonderful, wonderful, I'll give a shout out to Amanda. We have this wonderful student at PDS, who's been through many of our courses and is a certified integrated attachment theory coach, as well. And she, became really secure and she started dating again. And before she found the person I know she's dating now, she said, Thais, she came into a webinar. She was like, Thais, I met somebody and I'm kind of bored with them. Like, do I is this what it's supposed to feel like when you're securely attached? You just don't feel anything? And we had like a really good laugh about it because the answer is no. You're not, if you're bored, you're just bored. You're just not interested. Um, and whereas, and then she met somebody else and I think is in a really great relationship now. But just to be super clear here, like you don't become securely attached. So I know a lot of people have this question. You don't become securely attached and then, feel bored. That's not what it's supposed to feel like. You still have excitement and feelings and that strong, sense of feelings is there, but it doesn't feel like it's to survive, to fill this void within you that's so big. It feels like you can show up, do your life, think about them a little bit throughout the day, but you're focused. You can still be present with yourself, with what you're doing, with what's in front of you, with your friends, your family members, sleep properly through the night, have a normal appetite. Like there isn't this destabilizing element that can be there with limerence. So this is a good introduction to limerence. I hope it answers a lot of these different questions that you might have. Let me know any other questions you have in the comments below, and then stay tuned for the next parts of the series where we talk about anxious preoccupieds and limerence, fearful avoidance, dismissive avoidance, and some of the different dynamics that they're really likely to be limerent around in terms of traits and needs. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, and subscribe if you're enjoying this, and I can't wait to see you in future videos.